challenge your imagination to come alive and to battle with the creatures of Dungeons and Dragons. Grapple against the forces of evil as a Marvel Comics superhero. Hunt adventure and glory as Indiana Jones. The all-new role-playing games of TSR and Dungeons and Dragons. Unleash the power of your imagination.
Hey everybody, this is Perch. I've been talking about this general concept here for quite a while, and having a lot of conversations offline about this very question. So we'll get to the viewer mail. By the way, the first paragraph of the viewer mail is not indicative of the rest of the mail. So just throwing that out there. It really has nothing to do with kind of how it leads, in case you're one of those people that clicks away after 30 seconds. It says, the mail is how important is the established lore? And again, companies are wrestling with this. Publishers are wrestling with this. Fans are wrestling with this. Like, how important is it? Yeah, and it's one of those areas where it feels like companies try and entirely forget about it and get themselves into trouble, or they adhere so closely to it that they leave themselves no room for creativity and actually doing things forward. It's one of those things where people say it's very, very difficult, and I don't think it's that difficult. I think that people think it's difficult. That's the rub here. But anyway, let's see what this mail says. It says, Dear Perch, with all the recent talk about race swapping and changing the lore, I had a quick thought that I wanted to share with you. Okay. For most of human history, we have had an oral tradition of stories changed with the storyteller. Even after the introduction of writing and the ability to have an exact copy of the story preserved, there's always been reimaginings and changes to the established lore. For example, Lancelot and the Holy Grail, although now considered essential parts of King Arthur legend, are much later additions that didn't exist in the original Celtic folklore. It seems to me that people in the past used the established lore as a guideline, but would deviate from it to explore their own ideas and take a concept in a new direction. I think there's one hitch we're coming into. But anyway, this is where my head goes. But we'll finish up the mail. It says, I think that that's the natural way for stories to function, and we should judge each change on what it adds to the concept. This is how things worked even in the recent past. For example, Superman deviating from established lore is how Superman learned to fly. So here's, I think the general premise you've got here is correct. I think that is, obviously that's how storytelling has existed. That's how, things have functioned. And oftentimes that deviation from the original source material is what's led to a lot of creativity, a lot of really cool things. And sometimes those deviations are completely reimagining. It's one of the complaints that when we get into the whole arguments of race, that a bunch of European Anglo storytellers basically co-opted, or in a more ugly way, stole several of ancient myths from different cultures and made them their own. That's one of the accusations that's been kind of thrown around. And I say, accusations, they did do that. Well, yes, they did. But keep in mind that, everyone did that. So that doesn't make it right. But, the way you identified it in the mail is actually very correct. People come in, they find stories, they find lore, and then they put their own spin on it. And when different cultures were advancing and different cultures were moving kind of around the planet, you would see more co-opting of storytelling by the cultures that were dominant at the time. Roman Empire did a lot of it. So it's to me, it's less of a race issue and it's more of a history issue. This is what people did in history, and this is kind of why they say, what's the definition? History is written by the winners, by the conquerors. That's there's a reason for that, because they're still alive. Generally, to write is how that originally came about. Anyway, be that as it may, the difference in comics is that comics don't set the core difference between the two, and I think it's a critical one. This is kind of where my head's been at. Is that comics are ongoing stories. They're not complete stories. So Whereas you have like the Legend of King Arthur, you have, various, the kind of Grimm's fairy tales. You have, different myths, legends, and stories. Those stories tend to have a beginning, middle, and an end. They tend to be finite. They tend to be set up as, read and done. And I think in that world, being able to reimagine, retell the story, deviate from source material is easier. And, it's easier to wrestle with because basically you can say, okay, here's the original story, and here's, an alteration of the story. Here's a new spin on it. So you have story A now and story B. You, in effect, have two stories. But in comics, you don't have a beginning, middle, and end. You have, a beginning and an infinite middle. And so when you're trying to deviate from the lore, when you're trying to, retcon or recast or recreate things in comics, you're recreating something that is you're in the middle of. It's why you can point to it's why you can point to something and say, hey, they're casting Nemur as a kind of Latino, culture and Hispanic heritage. But in the comic, he's pasty white Spock. And, or depending on how excited the colorist got that day, maybe has a tan, but still, that's how he looked. And you have both running around at the same time until somebody in the comics are like, well, I guess we're subservient to the movies, and so we better start, redoing the character, and so we'll just start slowly, changing him around. I and that's the problem, is that comics aren't done. If the comics were completed, then I think you could alter the lore, you could change things, you could put your own spin on it. People still might complain. They might say, I like, story A better than what you did to create story B. You might still get that, but it's a hell of a lot less confusing than trying to alter something you're in the middle of. Your point about Superman is, I don't, it's correct, but it's also, I mean, with Powers, it was more along the lines of he just kind of learned to do something different. And then as you had the John Byrne post-crisis, and you had some of the other stuff, then they just kind of retconned some of the origin away, and you kind of explain it away by going, well, he couldn't fly for a while, and he figured out how to fly, and then he flew. And based on when you tell the story, that was later in life, or maybe that was when he was Superboy, and who knows, somewhere in there. I'm not. It's easier done than a complete kind of recasting of things. And to me, I think the biggest part that people have to wrestle with, as you mentioned in the beginning, it is when you race swap a character, but you still have the character in its original race in existence. And no matter how you deal with that, there's just no clean way to deal with it. I'll give you an example. Wonder Man has been cast by a actor who I like quite a bit. I think he was in Watchmen. He's been in a bunch of other. He's a great actor. I think he's horribly miscast as Wonder Man for a variety of reasons, many of which have nothing to do with his race. However, it is true that you're going to have Wonder Man running around in the comic again as a fairly pale white dude. Who's been that way for 50 years, 40 years, long time. And then in Disney Plus, you're going to have this series with this black actor who looks nothing like the comic. And what's going to happen is this tension of like, hey, why are they different? And you're going to have this big argument over, hey, he doesn't look like he looks in the comic. And then the other side's going to go, oh, you're racist for saying that. And then the first side's going to go, but I'm just looking at the comic. I'm literally just looking at the comic. And then you're going to get this, well, why can't he be black? It's like, because he's in the comic right now white. And you get this back and forth, but here's the underlying truth in this, the thing that you have to come to accept. It's that the comics frequently view themselves as secondary. So however this argument spins out, the way it goes is, well, the movies and the TV shows and what Disney puts out is more important. That is the source of truth, because it makes more money, because more people see it. That's the source of truth. The comics are lesser. The comics are secondary. So you take race completely out of the equation, as the guy who likes comics, as a person who's been reading comics for decades, I don't like the idea that we're basically saying the comics are secondary. I'd like for the comics to be, as important as the movies. I don't mean financially, just in terms of weighting. But you saw this a little bit with Nick Fury, and I think the actors, again, I like Samuel Jackson a great deal. I think his Nick Fury is great on the big screen. I didn't like that it created this scenario where the comics were like, well, more people know Nick Fury now as Samuel Jackson, so I guess we better change. And they came up with kind of a storytelling reason why they did this. But you're basically saying the last 40, 50 years that people have been attached to, fuck that. Because we cast this guy in this movie, for when he showed up in Iron Man for roughly 15 seconds of screen time, not even that, like 4 seconds of screen time. Well, that's what's important now. I hate that. I hate that I don't like what that, and I think some of the angst you get from the comic readers, just like you had from the Lord of the Rings readers. I've talked before, I'm not a big Lord of the Rings fan, but totally get the people who invested hours and hours and hours and hours of their lives reading and studying and paying attention to Lord of the Rings are basically told, hey, because of this TV show and movie, your stuff is lesser. And I don't like that because it's rarely positioned as this is a different spin on the lore. Like your mail, which I think was very well written, it's like this is a different way of telling the story. This is a different interpretation. It's not it's not positioned that way. The companies themselves and a lot of the fans position it as this is the real Wonder Man. This is the true Wolverine. This is the true. They immediately grab onto it as this is actually the way it's supposed to be. Some people had asked at one point, like, why wasn't there more outrage about Hawkman being cast as black? And one reason, yes, is his lore of, he's reincarnated, so, makes sense. But another reason is, I think this is the bigger reason. Nobody in that movie production went out and gave interviews saying, yeah, we thought that, racist comics needed more diversity, and so we did this, and people don't like it, suck, so, you trolls are awful. They didn't say any of that. They just made their movie. And I think with a lot of the lore and the changes and the things they put into movies and TV shows, if they simply just went with, this is a different interpretation, we're forging kind of our own tale on the narrative. The original narrative is just as important. Totally respect it. That's the source in which we got our idea from. So of course we respect it. If they just paid a little bit of respect to what came before, I mean, I think a lot of the irritation, a lot of the angst would go down. I think it's when people show up to pick a fight around the whole change that, you get the fight that you picked. Anyway, my feeling. Thank you very much for the mail. I appreciate it. Like I said, I've been wrestling with this question quite a bit. How do we handle that, changes to lore? I think, again, the big clue there is if it's an ongoing story like comics are, you have a lot less room to maneuver in this space than you do for, a fairy tale or, folklore or some story. But anyway, curious to get your take on it. Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course, and thanks for listening.